Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. My name is Andrew Gustafson, and we're going to get started in just a couple minutes. I see we still have some people joining us. And so before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to first wish everybody a happy Navy Day. Today is the birthday of the United States Navy, which is part of the reason why we decided to do this program today. I also wanted to just tell people how they can engage with the program today. So I am flying solo, sort of. I'm the only one who's sort of behind the camera today. So I will do my best to respond to any questions you have, which you can drop into the chat. We're going to be joined a little while later by Cindy, who's actually out in the neighborhood of Sunset Park, and we're going to look at some of the historical artifacts of this particular site and topic that we're talking about today. But I wanted to kind of outline what we're going to talk about with today's presentation. Talking about the title of this is Brooklyn and the Navy Armed Guards, Navy Armed Guard, excuse me. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit about the history of the particular site that we're going to be talking about, which is located at 51st Street and 1st Avenue in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, which during World War II was the Navy Armed Guards Center, Brooklyn. But that building actually predates World War II. So we're going to talk a little bit about its early history when it was the 2nd Battalion Armory of the New York Naval Militia. So we're going to talk about what is the Naval Militia, what is this building, why was it constructed, how did it function prior to World War II. Then we'll talk about what is the Armed Guard. This is also an organization that predates World War II. It was in service during both World Wars, actually. And so we'll talk about its origins and how the service operated in both those world wars, but then especially during World War II when they moved into this facility on 1st Avenue. And then we'll talk about what happened to this building after World War II. It was repurposed, sort of. It would continue to be used by the New York State Naval Militia. But the building is no longer there. So what remains of this very important history of the U.S. Navy Armed Guard in the neighborhood of Sunset Park? So those are some of the main themes that we're going to talk about. Again, I encourage you to drop any questions into the chat, and also please share your connections. I know we have a few people who are joining the program who have close connections to this organization and to the veterans that served. And so please feel free to drop those into the chat, and hopefully we can incorporate it into our conversation today. Okay, so let me first show you what is this place that we're talking about here, and where is it exactly? Okay, so this is a wonderful image of the building. There are so few good quality images, at least that I could find, of this building, and it was such, sort of an important part of the Sunset Park waterfront for such a long time, for a period of about 80 years. And so there you can see it. This photo was taken during World War II and by a person who you can see in the credits here, Clarence, and we'll talk more about him because he played such an important role in documenting the story of the Navy Armed Guards Center in Brooklyn during the war and subsequent to the war as well. So here you can see we're looking down 52nd Street, and we're looking west, and that's 1st Avenue that's in front of us there. So this building that's right here in the center is no longer there. This little building on the corner, that actually is still standing. And so we're basically adjacent to the Bush Terminal. So that gives you a sense of where we are. And so we'll also take a look at images of the inside, but let's talk a little bit about why this building was constructed and what was it constructed for. To understand that history, we have to look back at the history of naval militias. Most people probably don't even know what the naval militia is or that it even exists, but it is part of our state National Guard system. New York State was one of the first states to establish a naval militia. So they were created. The idea of them actually came about in the late 1880s when we were undergoing a period of naval expansion. We built the first steel ships of the US Navy, and there were a lot of prominent navalists that were trying to really get America's naval house in order. Among them, Alfred Thayer Mahan. And so they advocated for having a sort of part-time reserve force for the Navy that would be administered by the states. And so the New York State Naval Militia was established in 1891. And so it had its first battalion, which was in New York City. But then a second battalion was created in 1897. And so that was to be established in Brooklyn. Actually, the first event that they sort of came out in public was at the dedication of Grant's tomb in Manhattan in 1897. But they were incorporated just in time to participate in the Spanish-American War, which is what you're seeing in this image here. This is an old monitor, a ship sort of a previous era technologically that was refit, and it's here at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, crewed by a number of officers and sailors from the 2nd Battalion of the Naval Militia to guard the American coast. So this ship was actually sent out to Fisher's Island Sound, so the eastern end of Long Island Sound, waiting for the Spanish invasion that never came. So it was only activated for a brief period of a few months in the middle of 1898. I love this picture too. This was another ship that was attached to the Naval Militia after the 2nd Battalion Naval Militia after the Spanish-American War. This is the USS Eileen, which you can see is a converted sail yacht, basically. And this is actually in Dry Dock 1 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I love this photo because the former director of the Brooklyn Navy Yard Center at Building 92 is Eileen Chumard. And we got a print of when she left the Navy Yard back in 2017. This is her going away gift, was a picture of the USS Eileen. And so as the organization grew, they needed a place to drill. Now, the landscape of New York City is covered with these armories, very few of which actually still have military units attached to them. Some of them still do, but most of them don't. And most of them don't use them in the same way that they did back in the early 20th century for drilling. But there were these vast, vast halls where they could do military maneuvers indoors. Most of them were for National Guard Army units. This one was for a naval unit and Marines as well. So from that time that they were incorporated in 1897 up until this building was completed in 1907, they actually spent a lot of their time drilling at the Dean Street Armory, which is in Prospect Heights. So they start construction on this building in 1903. It's completed in 1907 and then dedicated in 1908. So you can see this image of it from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. So what was inside it? Well, here was the massive drill hall, and you can see some of those field artillery pieces there on the floor on the right-hand side of the image. And they would do all manner of training on basically so if they have field artillery pieces here, they might be using them for the Marine units to drill, but essentially they would use this drill hall to simulate the deck of a ship. And so that's what it was used for. And that's why it included also, you can see a mast here with the crow's nest. This would be replaced at some point in the 1920s. We're not exactly sure when, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But there was a much more elaborate mast that was placed in to reflect a more modern ship of the 20th century. Okay, so the militia is established in 1897. They get their first sort of sniff of action during the Spanish-American War. But then in World War I, we have the creation of another important naval unit that's important to our story, and that is the creation of the Armed Guard. So what is the Armed Guard? The Armed Guard are Navy sailors. So they are either enlisted Navy sailors or officers who, rather than being attached to a commissioned U.S. Navy warship, are attached to a merchant ship. So they are there to man guns that were mounted on those merchant ships in wartime. So the Armed Guard and the arming of merchant ships was authorized in early 1917. And in fact, the very first American casualties of World War I were members of this little known unit of the Armed Guard. And so we can see 3 of them here who were killed in 2 separate incidents. So the one on the left is John Iapolucci, who was killed aboard the USS Aztec. That was sunk by the SS Aztec, excuse me. So it was a merchant ship. That was sunk on April 1st, 1917 by Germany. And so while he was the first member of the Armed Guard that was killed, he was actually killed before the United States officially entered the war just a few days later. So actually, if we want to look at the very first casualties after the declaration of war, they would actually be the Armed Guard crew that was aboard the SS Vacuum that were killed on April 28th, 1917. And so we can see 2 of them right here. Clarence C. Thomas, who was the commanding officer of that Armed Guard unit. And I put in here one of the crew members who was killed, Alexander Donald, because he was actually a New Yorker who was from Corona, Queens. So these are the very first casualties of World War I. Now, there would be a pretty robust program in World War I of arming merchant ships. And at the peak, the program in the Armed Guard would have about 30,000 sailors that would participate in it during the 18 months or so that the United States was involved in World War I, 19 months that they're involved in World War I. Another Brooklyn connection to the Armed Guard of World War I. This is Frederick Lewis Reifkohl, who was rose to the rank of admiral actually by the time of World War II. He has Brooklyn connections because he was actually stationed quite a bit for quite a bit of his career at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He's also notable for being the first U.S. Navy officer from Puerto Rico. And he was assigned to the SS Philadelphia in 1917, which you can see here on the left, and you can see an example of some of the guns that were mounted on these ships. So he kind of got his career started, or his real career sort of really took off after he got this command in the Armed Guard and received some significant citations for that. So, so we have this period of about 1.5 years in which the Armed Guard is activated, and then it's basically deactivated after World War I. And the Naval Armory, though, it continues to operate. And I should clarify that during World War I, the Naval Armory in Sunset Park was not the Armed Guard Center. I mean, there were certainly members of the New York State Naval Militia who participated in the Armed Guard in World War I, but it wasn't utilized for that specific purpose during the war. But so I just want to mention a couple important moments in the history here about some of the artifacts that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. So one is here you can see mention of a flagpole that was installed in 1914. not exactly sure where on the site this particular flagpole was installed, but sort of the provenance of the flagpole will become important later on. I mentioned also before that at some point that mast that was inside the drill hall was replaced inside the Naval Armory. And it's likely that that took place during the interwar period, although I haven't been able to find sort of definitive evidence about that. So we find this interesting item here from 1924 that says that the Naval Armory received the bell from the ship USS Brooklyn. Now, the USS Brooklyn was a cruiser. It participated in the Spanish-American War. It was also part of the Great White Fleet that went around the world in 1907. And following World War I, it was scrapped. And so its bell was given to the Armory. Now, I mentioned that it's somewhat significant because pieces of the Brooklyn, according to some reports, would wind up inside the Naval Armory later on. But I haven't been able to find direct evidence of when that was done. So it would probably be around this time period when the Brooklyn was being cut up for scrap, that pieces of the ship, namely pieces of the bridge, would be taken to the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn, or what will become the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn. So this is the bell, by the way. So it's still around. We'll talk about the fate of the artifacts that were inside the building, but it is at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, which is at the Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Okay, so World War II is really the centerpiece of our story, and that is really, when we think about the history of the armed guard, you could think about World War I as sort of a preview, and then World War II was really when this program took off, and we had more than 140,000 sailors that participated in it. And so we're going to talk about two parts of this. One is actually arming the ships, and then the second was crewing them with these Navy sailors. And so the arming of Navy ships is something that also happened, like in World War I, prior to the U.S. official entry into the war. The U.S. had been doing various things. President Roosevelt had been doing various things to get the United States sort of connected to the Allies even before we were official belligerent in the war, including the Lend-Lease program, the Destroyers for Bases program, and then also arming of merchantmen as the North Atlantic became increasingly dangerous, even for American flagged ships, as the Battle of the Atlantic was raging, and that the United States, again, as nominally a neutral power, was providing huge quantities of supplies to basically keep Great Britain in the war. The Brooklyn Navy Yard would be an important center for this activity of arming these merchant ships. You can see this cover of Life magazine from February 1942. And so a lot of that work actually wouldn't be done at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but would be coordinated out of the yard at dozens of other shipyards around New York Harbor. And in all, I believe something around 450 ships were converted under the direction of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They were armed with various types of armaments. And so there were a lot of different modifications that need to be made to ships. Often it would involve installing new radio equipment on them, as well as putting in these platforms to mount the guns on, either on the stern or the bow or on the sides of the ship. Here we can see workers that are in a shipyard down in Red Hook, Brooklyn, that are building they're welding together some of those gun tubs that'll be mounted on the ships. And of course, they were modifying ships of all different sizes and types. Here you can see another typical armament that was on these ships, which was a machine gun. I believe this is a 50 caliber machine gun. in one of the tubs you can see mounted on here. And then, of course, there were, very large passenger liners that also had to be armed. And so here we can see them also at one of the piers in Red Hook, Brooklyn, undergoing these modifications here. Okay, so there are various types of armaments that were pretty typical on these ships, and that included, like I mentioned, there would be machine guns, but also 3-inch, 4-inch, and 5-inch guns that would be mounted on them. Now, all of these ships that we're talking about being modified, these are civilian ships. And for the most part, these ships, especially in the early days of the war, are actually owned by private shipping companies. And so you could almost think of the Armed Guard program as like a public-private partnership, in that the vast majority of the people that are on that ship when it goes to sea, that are operating it, are civilian mariners. They are members of the Merchant Marine, but they are working for private shipping companies. But when you put the armed guard on these ships, here you can see them with a 20-millimeter gun, you have this sort of hybrid crew that's operating, that has different procedures, has different chains of command. And there would be times where there was conflicts, but there was also a lot of cooperation that needed to take place in order for everyone to survive. And it actually took a while, well into 1942, to work out a lot of the kinks for operating this, where you're essentially having Navy sailors operating on private ships, because they did have different procedures, and they sort of in some ways came from different worlds. Oftentimes the sailors that would be joining the Armed Guard, they got 3 weeks of training at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center. And that was their first time, when they arrived at a ship as a member of the Armed Guard, it might be their first time ever going to sea. And usually a merchant crew would have a pretty seasoned crew on board. So there was a pretty steep learning curve for a lot of members of the Armed Guard. Same thing with the officers. Oftentimes they were very young ensigns who were in command of this contingent of enlisted sailors. And they're working alongside a ship's master who might be 40 plus years at sea. So that you can see where there could be potential for conflict there. We should also mention the fact that the pay was very different in a couple different ways, not just in the sheer amount that they got paid. When you're talking about the sailors, the Navy sailors versus the merchant mariners. For one, if you were in the Navy, you were getting paid whether you were on leave, whether you were on a ship, whether you were undergoing training. If you were a member of the Merchant Marine, your pay stopped as soon as you got off the ship. That included as soon as you stepped aboard a lifeboat and were floating away from that ship if it got attacked. So while the sort of base pay for merchant mariners, American merchant mariners, was often quite a bit higher than their enlisted sailor counterparts. They sort of lived in different worlds and lived with different risks, but they all lived with the risk that they might get sunk. And that was a very, very real risk, especially when we're talking about the period when this program is getting underway in late 1941, early 1942. This is a period of really intense U-boat activity and also a period of what's called Operation Drumbeat, when Germany, shortly after their declaration of war against the United States in December 1941, they send a small group of U-boats to basically wreak havoc against American coastal shipping, and America was completely unprepared. We had really not made any preparations for convoying. We had totally insufficient armed Navy ships in order to escort these convoys. And then basic preparations like turning off the lights along the shore so you stop silhouetting ships that are passing by just wasn't done well into the spring of 1942. So the Germans call this their second happy time, when they basically just run riot along the American coast and in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic until the Americans and British can kind of get their house in order. So while there may have been, again, different procedures, different chains of command, and different incentives for merchant mariners and for armed guard sailors, the risks were very much the same. This could also, there were other areas, where you could cause conflict, which is that the officers of the armed guard crews were responsible for the defense of the ship. So that meant that they had to coordinate, obviously the firing of the guns, but in order to fire the guns effectively, you have to steer the ship. So again, when it comes down to actual, when you're engaged with the enemy, who has the final say, the ship's master or the armed guard officer in command? That was another area where you could run into problems if there wasn't good cooperation. Luckily, in most circumstances, there was good cooperation. The Navy learned from some of its early mistakes by sending more experienced sailors and more experienced officers out on these detachments, because they had to work together. And this is a prime example we can see in this image here. I'm finally going to talk about this image up on the screen. But oftentimes the armed guard crews were too small to effectively man all of these guns, and they would require the assistance of the civilian mariners on that ship, oftentimes doing things like carrying ammunition. And there were circumstances when they actually did have to fire the guns. And the merchant marine training facilities did actually train sailors on how to operate these guns, train the merchant sailors how to operate these guns as we progress further into the war. Now, we talked about the risks in the North Atlantic, but one of the key routes that the armed guard sailers would be sailing on was the route to Murmansk on the Arctic coast of the Soviet Union. And this run, actually, the very first armed guard crew to go out, which was in early December 1941, that's where they went. So that was another key supply route, not just keeping Great Britain supplied, but also supplying the Soviet Union. And obviously not a very pleasant place to sail, especially in the wintertime. So the Murmansk run was famous for the incredible hardship and obviously the cold. So cold weather gunnery practice was extremely, extremely important. And the hub of the Murmansk run was New York, and the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center is where those sailors would be sent out from. Okay, so here we can see an image of sailors arriving at the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center. So let's talk a little bit about how this facility actually functioned. So it was, so the Armed Guard was officially created in November 1941. So again, a little bit before the United States entry into the war. And so the first recruits arrived there on November 18th, 1941. It was a small detachment of just 184 enlisted and 23 officers. Now, the original intention was to take the 2nd Battalion, New York Naval Militia Armory, and turn it into a barracks for British sailors. But they quickly realized that there would be a tremendous need for sailors and for the arming of merchant ships and for American sailors to be on those ships. So that plan was actually quickly scrapped soon after. And very soon after the US Navy took over this building, they realized that it was just too small. Men were really packed to the gills inside of this building. And so that vast drill hall that we saw images of before, that was filled with well over 1,700 triple-deck barracks to fit in there. So there were thousands and thousands of men that were passing through here, but it's important to remember that very few of those sailors were actually stationed there and spending the majority of their time there. Most of them were there for a matter of days, waiting for them to be assigned to a detachment that would go out on a ship. Then they would usually do the round trip, wherever that was, to Great Britain or to North Africa, or to the Suez Canal. And then they would come back to the Armed Guard Center, be there for a couple days, and then get assigned to a new place. So there were thousands of sailors that were rotating through there all the time, but they never spent very much time there at all, which meant that there was no time really for training. So the training that they did was, there was very, very limited that was done here in Brooklyn. But if you join the Armed Guard, usually you would start your career in the Armed Guard down in Little Creek, Virginia, which is where the training center was in the early days of the war. And then additional training centers were created. But this is kind of where you would basically just lay your head for a couple days, in between your deployments. So here you can see the sailors arriving there. We can see that's it, behind them is the brick edifice of the building. I mentioned before that this was originally sort of devised to be a center for British sailors. And the British actually had a completely different system for manning the guns in their merchant ships, that they were actually manned by British merchant sailors who were, expected to, to man and fully operate the guns themselves. But here you can see that they were doing some training. This is over the Bristol Channel in the west of England. But the idea of turning the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn entirely for British sailors was scrapped pretty quickly. Yeah, and so these would be sort of mixed crews, like I mentioned before. This is a picture from the Naval History and Heritage Command, where the merchant mariners and the Armed Guard would work side by side. And I should mention an important thing sort of about the status of them as veterans. This is something that was fought for a very long time. Obviously, the status of the Armed Guard sailors is unquestioned because they were enlisted and officers in the United States Navy. But the men that served alongside them and received fire from the enemy and returned fire to the enemy, helping with those gun crews, didn't receive the same recognition. And there's still actually a fight going on to give full recognition and compensation to the sadly small number of surviving American merchant marine veterans from World War II. Yeah, so I'll just check in with Cindy to see if she's anywhere nearby. Oh, hey, Cindy. So here we can see a picture of what was the overflow barracks, but I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm going to spotlight Cindy, who's standing on the corner of 52nd Street and 2nd Avenue in Sunset Park. Hey, Cindy, how's it going?
Hi, good to see you. Great program.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm here at 52nd Street and 2nd Avenue, and this is the building that you just showed in the photograph. Looks like there's some scaffolding up. It's under construction at the moment. And I'm actually not sure. I mean, this whole area is an industrial section near the waterfront. We're going to make our way further down towards the water later on in the program. But yeah, it's mostly industrial buildings. The hospital is a couple blocks from here, but just give people a sense of the space today.
Yeah, and Cindy, that's an important point about the context in which this building, in which the Naval Armed Guard Center operated, and that it was really in the heart of the working waterfront of Brooklyn. And so it was actually built right next to the Bush Terminal, like I mentioned before, which was one of the largest shipping hubs of New York Harbor. Also, a large portion of it was taken over by the Army, and it was incorporated into the New York Port of Embarkation. So you have the Bush Terminal a little bit to the north, and maybe we'll see where that is as we head down 52nd Street. And then you have the Brooklyn Army Terminal to the south, another major hub and the headquarters for the New York Port of Embarkation. So 52nd Street and First Avenue was a perfect location because this is where all the ships are loading and unloading anyway. Now, that's not to say that every sailor could just walk down the street to get on board their ship they were assigned to in the armed guard. In many cases, they'd be sent to Boston or Philadelphia or other ports around the East Coast, because this was the hub for the whole East Coast. You had another armed guard center in New Orleans and another one on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. So basically, armed guards, sailors could be sent from anywhere. But if you're lucky, you might just be able to go one block over to the Bush Terminal and get on board a ship. Now, we're here looking at this building right here. This is actually an old Brooklyn, Manhattan rapid transit garage used for repairing streetcars. And during World War II, the Navy actually took over this building and turned it into a barracks and offices for the Navy Armed Guard Center, because there was such a demand for space. So that's why I wanted to take a peek at that. But we'll stick with Cindy. If you want to walk down 52nd Street, maybe we'll stay with you until we get down to First Avenue.
Sure. No
so
problem.
Although we don't have the Armory building itself is no longer standing, we still have this building, which served the same purpose. So this was called. So this was acquired in August of 1943. They also built a wooden barracks building next to the Armed Guard Center, so down on First Avenue, which had another 3,200 beds. So, on an average night, depending on what point you are in the war, early in the war, 1942, you might have, 3,000 daily occupancy. By the time you get to 1944, 1945, that's might be pushing, or 1944 is the peak, November 1944, that might be pushing 5,000. But it would depend, you had a lot of sailors coming in and out of there. So it was a really huge administrative job to administer all these sailors coming through, because at the peak in November 1944, there's about 66,000 sailors that are attached to the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center. And that would be nearly half of all of the armed guard sailors in total. So again, at the peak, we have about 145,000 sailors that are attached to this unit.
Andrew, may I ask a question? Yeah. So okay, it's definitely a place to kind of lay your head, right? But what other kinds of services would the sailors be receiving when they either came in from being out on the ships or before they were shipping out?
That is a great question. And so I'm going to share my screen again. And share with you a little bit of what we know about it, thanks to a person I mentioned before, Clarence Corker. So I mentioned that most people who were, if they were in the armed guard, they spent very, very little time at the Armed Guard Center. Clarence was an exception. He had to have an operation, and so he wasn't able to go to sea, but he was assigned to the Armed Guard Center, and so he became the photographer for it. And so here he is in the darkroom that he set up at the Armed Guard Center. And, he basically just documented what was going on there. So he had to go to different events. He photographed, sporting events and just kind of daily life, and, entertainment, USO shows. He documented at the Armed Guard Center. And Clarence is actually still alive. I was lucky enough to connect with Clarence over Facebook recently. There is a Armed Guard Center Facebook group, and I know we have some folks who are in the audience who are connected to that. But he's has this incredible collection and incredible knowledge as well about the Armed Guard Center, because he was one of the few people that was there, full time, especially enlisted. There were officers that were there full time, and none of those people are around anymore. But he's still around, and he really knew the daily life of the Armed Guard Center from when he was assigned there in 1943 through 1945. He did a brief oral history you can find online, and we'll share that afterwards along with other resources related to this talk. The other thing that he did was create a newspaper that was printed every 2 weeks called The Pointer. And at the website armedguard.com, you can find many issues of it as well. And with the creation of those barracks, one thing they were able to do was take that drill hall, or drill deck, I should say. Everything about the Armed Guard Center, you talk about as like being on a ship. It's sort of a ship on land. You talk about being aboard the Armed Guard Center, and you have the drill deck and the lower deck. But they're able to take that huge drill deck and use it for other things. Like here we can see this is the ceremonies for VE Day in May of 1945. But they also use it again for mess halls and performances and things like that. And Clarence was actually assigned to follow President Truman as he went around New York on Navy Day in October of 1945. And so he went around with him, aboard the USS Missouri, and to visit the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and to the dedication, the commissioning of the USS FDR there as well. So he shares some of that in his oral history as well. So here you can see some of the images that Clarence was kind enough to share. Again, you can see USO shows. Down, we can also see the sick bay. And on the right, you can see that sort of flying bridge that was taken supposedly from the USS Brooklyn. So we can see that there, that was inside the drill hall. Yeah, so Cindy, I can see you're approaching our destination. Before you get there, there is one thing I want to play for you, and that's another oral history. This is of a person we got to meet a few years ago at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, named John Custodio, and he was kind enough to participate in an oral history project. And just so you know, if folks know any veterans or veterans themselves, we're continuing to collect oral histories connected to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Brooklyn Army Terminal and New York Port of Embarkation, not just in World War II, but beyond. So please keep us in mind, and we'd love to house them in the Brooklyn Navy Yard archive. But I want to play for you a little bit about John, of his voice, talking about coming to the Armed Guard Center and then what it was like crossing the Atlantic.
You stay there until you get a ship.
Right.
And I think I stayed there a week. And after the third trip, I went back to the Armed Guard Center, and maybe another week or two, I got another ship, and they ship you out.
Yeah, so there wasn't a lot of time in between.
No,
your
not at
being
the Armed
shipped
Guard
out.
Center.
Yeah. Because I heard it was pretty cramped in there. I read.
Yes, it was. It wasn't bad. I mean, it's a tremendous big hut, and if you could look down on there, you see 40 tables this way, another 40 here, and everybody sleeps in that same building, and they eat in the same building. Yeah, I made 5 trips across, and somebody said, well, do you see any action? And I tell them, you cannot go in the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean without seeing action. You either see the submarines or you see the German planes. My first trip over was New Year's Day, 1943. We were pulling into Oran, and one ship that was to the port side, the left of us, pulled in front of us and blew up. It took 2 torpedoes, German. We thought it was German torpedoes, but somebody said it was from an Italian sub, so we don't know. At that particular time, the Italians were fighting with the Germans. And probably a year later, the Italians surrendered. But meanwhile, they were still fighting in the Mediterranean.
Right.
March of 1943, somewhere near the Azores, we had 3 or 4 days, we had 9 ships sunk.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention, just a little bit about, since John here mentions the losses. I want to correct one thing. I said there were 66,000 that were attached. That's how many were sent out in 1944, but there are 59,000 attached to the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center at the peak in November 1944. But in terms of total losses connected to the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center, there were 505 ships sunk, with the loss of 67 officers and 1,330 enlisted. We also had 412 officers and 7,679 enlisted who survived sinkings, many of them who spent many, many days and weeks. There was even a detachment that spent 82 days at sea in a lifeboat. But we also have to remember that of all the ships that went across, less than, coming out of New York during World War II, less than 1% were sunk. So the convoy system and the armed guard were tremendously successful in keeping that lifeline open across the Atlantic throughout World War II. Okay, so we just have a few minutes left. So what I want to do now is we're going to cut to Cindy. And Cindy, tell us a little bit about where you're standing.
Yeah, so I'm close to First Avenue. We're looking, I'm standing on First Avenue, or sorry, not First Avenue, 51st Street, between the waterfront and where we're looking out now, which is First Avenue. And across the street from where I'm standing is the Department of Sanitation building, which is where the Armed Guard Center, one of the Armed Guard Center buildings used to be.
Yeah, so the main armory building, yeah. So what happened to this after World War II? So, the Armed Guard is basically deactivated in 1945, and this building reverts back to the New York State Naval Militia. And so they continue to operate it up until 1975. Now, like a lot of armories, it served other purposes. It had become, a community center because of all these amenities that were actually built for it during World War II. So it had a bowling alley. It also had a swimming pool, really the only swimming pool in the neighborhood. And so, it had become an important kind of anchor of the community in the years after the war. Then in 1975, basically the city of New York and the state cut off funding for it. And so it closed down and was allowed to just fall into a pretty dilapidated state. And so the building was torn down in the 1980s in order to make way for the sanitation garage here. Is there something you want to show us, Cindy?
Yeah, I did actually. So looking in this direction, so this is, I'm looking north onto First Avenue. There's a truck idling here, so sorry if that's a little noisy.
No, we can't hear it.
Okay, great. So about a block, so you see that there's all these trees and foliage across from the Department of Sanitation facility. So there's sort of like a section of land here that seems like it's, I'm not sure what the use presently is. And then just beyond that is an entrance. It's a new entrance, relatively new entrance to Bush Terminal Park. And there's like a whole section of land. We did separate virtual programs about Bush Terminal previously, but there's an entrance that's just a block away. But where I'm going to take you next is actually to a memorial that was dedicated. I believe, Andrew, you can provide more of this context, but
Yep.
Back in 2006. And in order to get there, which we know John actually shared with you, Andrew, that he came down to this memorial himself periodically, but in order to get there, you really need to walk along this whole area that's surrounded by Department of Sanitation uses.
Yeah, so we're basically, we have city property on both sides of us. So on the left, we have the sanitation garage. On the right is the Bush Terminal Industrial Park, and then there's also apparently some land in here that's owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. But it's all public land that's in this area. Now, when the Armed Guard Center was torn down, they did take out those artifacts, or some of them were rescued. I think some of them were taken by the New York State Archives. Some of them were taken by the Navy History and Heritage Command. And so the Bell did survive. Now, what happened to the flying bridge, or that crow's nest from the USS Brooklyn? Not exactly sure, although there is a belief that this flagpole right here actually came from the USS Brooklyn, that was rescued and erected here to be part of this memorial that's right here. So here we can see this is from 1982. When they started the dismantling of this area. This report from the Daily News says that this flagpole was on both the USS Brooklyn of 1896 and also the USS Brooklyn of 1858, which is not right. But anyway, is this the flagpole that's standing right there? Maybe someone could shed some clarification on that. It's very possible. Just haven't found the direct connection between the scrapping of the Brooklyn in 1924, it being delivered to the Armed Guard Center, and then it being there continuously until the flagpole was put up here. So the first memorial was actually put up on the site in 1987. And this is a plaque that was there, is not there now. So it says, "We, the U.S. Navy Armed Guard World War II vets, would like to thank our brothers of the Vietnam War vets for remembering us when they raised this historical flagpole that was salvaged when the center was demolished. The flagpole was aboard the battleship USS Brooklyn, which engaged our enemies in the Spanish-American War, World War I, and the Armed Guard Center during World War II. It was brought back to honor all veterans which fought for our country." So this was dedicated in 1987. The site was rededicated in 2002, which is when this photo comes from. And there was some press coverage of that. And you can also find a lot of photos of that ceremony from at the armedguard.com website. So that's kind of the story of the dedication here. Maybe, Cindy, you could get in closer, like at the sidewalk level, so people can see like what this area looks like now. So you can see there's sort of this cutout in the fence. And then we have these bollards. So at least a sanitation truck can't knock over the flagpole. But, as we get towards winter and they start using those snow plows, those will get piled up here. And also if it's a day when they're picking up trash from sidewalk trash cans, they also often get piled up right here. Now, I should say that it was members of the New York City Sanitation Department, who rescued this flagpole, who worked to put it up and dedicate this memorial. And so we're eternally grateful to them for that. But it's not in a good state condition right now. You can see that the plaque that does remain, it's really hard to read right here, but it does not mention the Armed Guard in that particular plaque that's still there. So there's really if someone were to wander upon this, which is very unlikely that someone were to wander down Second Avenue through the middle of a garbage truck parking lot, basically. But if they did, they would have no context about what this is, what this memorial represents, and what once stood here. And so I think, to put this in context of what's going on in the neighborhood right now, again, just behind this flagpole in the direction that Cindy's looking is where we have the Bush Terminal Industrial Park, which is a city-owned property that's undergoing redevelopment. Steiner Studios is going to be building a large film and television production studio there. And there's also going to be Made in New York, which is a fashion design and production facility that's being built as well. Oh yeah, Cindy, did I miss something?
I just wanted to clarify. Second Avenue is where we started, and this is if you're walking down 51st towards the water from First Avenue towards the water.
Sorry. Yeah,
and then I'd also be happy to read what's on the plaque.
Oh, sure.
That's hard to see from home. So it says, in memory of all the men and women who gave their lives for this great nation, you will not be forgotten.
Yeah, again, a very poignant plaque, but because that original plaque from 1987 does not survive, there's no context for a visitor here. So with all the development that's going on in this area, this seems like a good opportunity to also, create a more suitable memorial to the armed guard, something that could be more permanent and provide context and is more easily accessible to the public. Now, it may be difficult to put it on this exact lot here because of the presence of the Department of Sanitation, but and I know 52nd Street is also not a suitable street, but maybe something along First Avenue might be more suitable for it. And now I think would be a good time to do something like that because of all of the projects that are underway right now in this immediate vicinity. Yeah.
Andrew, I have a question for you, which is the timeline. So we know from your research that it's 1987 was the original one.
Yep.
Per your understanding. And then is the timeline then that there was a rededication? Is it in 2002 or 2006 or are you not?
It's 2002. Yeah, 2002.
Oh, it's 2002. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, which Cindy mentioned, John participated in that. John sadly passed away a few years ago. He's buried not far in Greenwood Cemetery, and he lived for many years, also not too far away in Brooklyn. So like Cindy said, he would come down here when he could. But yeah, so that kind of brings us to the end of our story, but it's not the end, of course, because this is something that we're trying to push for. And if you'd like to, if you can help shed more light on the story of the Armed Guard Center, it's something that we'd really like to present to local elected officials, to the community board, to see, if a more appropriate Armed Guard memorial could be part of some of the projects that are happening in the neighborhood right now. But I encourage you, if you are in Sunset Park, take a walk down 51st Street, walk west on it, west of First Avenue, and come check it out and pay your respects. Navy Day is a good day to do it, but if you're going to be coming down to the Brooklyn Army Terminal for Open House New York, I encourage you to come and check it out. This is a public street, and so this is meant to be publicly accessible, but it's just not very publicly visible right now. But yeah, so if there aren't any questions or comments, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us. Please tune in for our programs that we're going to be doing during Open House New York weekend. I want to thank Cindy so much for going down there and giving us a live view of this location. Cindy, anything you want to add before we go?
No, thank you so much. This was really informative, and I'm really grateful too that you were the one that met John on a tour and thought to do an oral history with him about his experience, and that's just so valuable. Having an understanding of the impact that it had on him serving in the Armed Guard, and that, yeah. I think gives that human context that's just so important when we're doing historical research.
Yeah.
So thank you, Andrew.
And I know I probably made some mistakes. I know I rambled a little bit. I'm not an expert on the armed guard, but again, in the follow-up and on our website, we're going to share some more resources, some great books that we encourage you to check out, some more oral histories to listen to hear it from the men who actually lived through this. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us. And we will see you on Saturday. All right. Thanks so much, Cindy.
Thank you.